Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sofia Parente. I'm Policy and Campaigns Coordinator at Sustainable Food Places, and I work at Sustain. And I'm here to give you the welcome and to give support to this session today, but I'm really going to pass on very quickly to the experts. So this session is being recorded. So you'll have the chance to catch up with the recording later on if you wish to. We would like to invite you to use the chat function to ask any questions you have to the presenters. So feel free to open the chat function. I'm just going to ask everyone to mute your microphone unless you're asking a question or giving a presentation. So please mute your microphones, please. Thank you very much. So welcome to this webinar, Update on Using the English Planning System. So I'm shortly going to pass to my colleague Gillian, who is going to give you an introduction to the planning system and relevance to food. And then we're going to hear a council perspective from Cllr Katie Thornburrow from Cambridge City Council. So how best to work with councils on this matter. We'll have a community perspective of how food partnerships can engage local planners from Emily O'Brien. She's Policy and Partnerships Manager at Brighton Hove Food Partnerships. We'll have an opportunity for questions. So if you have questions for Gillian, for Katie, or for Emily, please jot them down on the chat. Then we're going to Gillian again, because she's going to cover the national planning reforms that are forthcoming. And this is where you will have an opportunity to hear about these reforms, but also what role you can play in that response that we want to send across. And next, we're going to hear about the next steps. So this is really a whistle-stop tour of the planning system. And there will be opportunities for you to get involved. But if you want to work more closely with Gillian on these matters, there's an invitation for you to stay in touch. And maybe we can do a masterclass, more sessions like this in the future. So leave your ideas for how we can carry on meeting and working together on the chat. So I'm going to pass on to Gillian.
Right, thank you, Sophia, for that excellent introduction. And I'll go straight into my slides. So yes, this is going to be a whistle-stop tour. So if there are any questions, post them up, or any queries. And I should reiterate that it is about the English planning system, because there's different legislation elsewhere. And what I was thinking is that probably most people, most citizens, start to think about planning from the top left of this chart. Most people would really hear about planning in the context perhaps of an extension that their next door neighbour is going to do, or if there's a hot food takeaway shop that's going to come to their local parade that might be a bit controversial, or a new residential development on a field or a park nearby. So it's generally something that's controversial, there's uproar in the local area, and people write letters and talk to their councillors and get involved with planning that way. And what I'm going to, the key message today really is that's the wrong end to start. And if you want to influence the planning system, you really need to be starting in the bottom right-hand corner with the preparation of your local plan. Because if you see that the proposed new development leads into an application is made to the local planning authority, which generally speaking is the District Council, London Borough Unitary Authority. And then the way that that decision is made is primarily looking at policy. So it starts off with the national policy, if there's anything that's of relevance to the application there. Then it looks at the local plan and what criteria there are in the local plan that are of relevance to making that decision. And then there are other considerations that take place after that. So if you want to affect the way that a decision is made, you really need to be getting involved in the local plan and finding out what stage your local plan's at, and try and contribute to that. The sorts of things that you'll be thinking about as a sustainable food region is looking from this diagram. You can see how you've got the urban centre and all the different elements of food that's then stretched out into the rural hinterland. And what we say in planning is that we look at anything that is spatial. So planning is about place making. It's the best use of land and buildings. And the aim is to achieve sustainability and to balance social, economic, environmental issues. So the starting point is to have a vision. And the local planning authority will be developing that vision. But who is going to make them think about food in that vision? So what I'd recommend that food partnerships do is to think about your place. You're the one that knows your place best. And think about how the current food system works in a spatial sort of way. Whereabouts are the shops selling good food? How easy is it to buy good food as opposed to junk food? How far away do you have to walk or cycle, get a bus, or have to drive to do that? Is there space to grow food near to where people live? What's the land use on the urban fringe? Is it productive land, or is it all being fenced off for horses, or worse still, just left vacant? So those are all the things that are spatially relevant to food in your area. And what we did here at the Cardiff conference was think about how the place could change. What would it look like if it was a sustainable food city region that you were living in? And that's the case that you would then take to your local planning authority. So by having that vision, you would know what issues are key to your own area and what needs to be changed. Now, when I started working with Sustain as a planner, there were some things that I knew food was relevant to being a planning issue, and space for growing community gardens was my main work at that time. And the more and more I've learned about Sustain and sustainable food regions is that there are so many interactions with the planning system, and the planning system can help you achieve your objectives in your local area. And these are some of the things that I know you are working on yourselves. But the key is, how do you change that round to make the planners and the council interested? And so you have to talk their language really, and be looking at the strategic objectives that they're interested in. And I'm sure you can look at all of these immediately and recognise how your case can fit into these council priorities. And that will make planners sit up and listen, because they're not ignoring you because they don't agree. It's just that they are very busy people, they are very stretched teams, and they've just not thought about it. They hadn't really thought about how access to good food affects the social, economic and environmental space and placemaking in your area. So make it easy for them and present in that sort of way. I've just cut out 3 slides, which you can go back to with the recording, but it shows the different sorts of ways that a local plan policy might come out in your local plan, depending on your own local area. So in Carlisle's local plan, it was really upfront, right at the beginning of their plan. So their spatial policy and their vision encaptured Carlisle being a food city. And so right from the very beginning, they knew that there were different ways that they should be planning the city to meet those objectives. Hull worked long and hard, and I think Hilary was going to join us on the webinar today as a guest. I think it was quite an eye-opener for the Food Partnership in Hull to realise how long it takes to get the policies you'd like to see into the local plan. It is a very time-consuming area, and sometimes it gets stuck, sometimes for years, and then it re-emerges again. So you do have to have patience, but they got there in the end, and they've got a strong support in their planning service there for local food growing. And then these 2 plans there, recently adopted, they also have looking at sustainable development principles and supporting local food production, and policies for hot food takeaways. And we've done a separate report on that if you're particularly interested in that issue of planning. So the key messages, I would say, for this very quick fly through the planning process is for you to be thinking about what you want your place to look like, so that you can be addressing the key messages. Think about the developer's role and speak to developers, and maybe we've got some developers on the meeting. It's of benefit to you too to improve the social and environmental attractiveness of your development. And for councils, it's got benefits there for meeting their strategic objectives. So with that, I'll pass on for you to actually hear from the council and how best that you can be coordinating with them and getting your message across.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Katie.
Yes. I'll share my screen now. Hello. I've been an architect and researcher for over 30 years, and a lot of my energy has gone into working on how to adapt the built environment to mitigate the effects of climate change, considering how to flood-proof or storm-proof homes, or how to make them more energy efficient. As we considered these more and more extreme situations, I started to ask a rather important question. If we're in an emergency, how will we eat? Where will the food come from? How will the shelves in the shops be filled? And then I asked a more significant question. Where does the food come from now? Not just from the supermarkets, but from which farmers? Where is it grown? How does it get to the communities that need it? How resilient is that system? So I took a year out to do a master's degree in food policy under Tim Lang at City University, and I never went back. After graduating, I became active in local politics and stood for an election at Cambridgeshire County Council and lost. So the following year, I stood for election at Cambridge City Council and I won. Now I'm in the Cambridge City Council Labour Executive for Planning Policy and Open Spaces, and I've been working for the last 18 months to deliver real change in food supply through the planning system. I want to start by talking about the small steps that change behaviour and perception, then the bigger steps we can take, because I think it will help you understand how you can work with willing local authorities to make real change. Food is important but it can be hard to motivate people around it. So I decided to go for an easier target first. I was in charge with open spaces and focused on biodiversity with a campaign around hedgehogs and small mammals. After all, who could complain about a council trying to look after hedgehogs? We linked up with a small local charity to promote logging when hedgehogs were spotted to understand the populations in the city. Then I took it into my planning portfolio by asking people to cut hedgehogs' doorways in fences while running education programs about the huge loss in the numbers. I, as a councillor, kept asking, cajoling, reminding, insisting, persuading that these small steps must be taken. I started adding this as an advisory notice on planning applications to encourage homeowners, and now it's part of the standard planning boundary conditions on developments. The council now offers doorway cutting as a council service, and we have most of the developers providing them where possible in new homes with gardens. Some people did get exasperated with my persistence, and sometimes I'm known as a hedgehog lady, but I don't mind because this campaign has given me the ability to talk more widely about biodiversity. And I use that freedom to talk about food supply and food policy and to shape the way we use land that we control and influence land use elsewhere. 3 good examples are meanwhile spaces, allotments, and food hubs. The City Council owns many small parcels of land dotted around the city. Some are waiting for development, some are almost landlocked. One large corner plot was waiting for development for council housing, but laid vacant for many years and in an area with allotments nearby but no shared community space. The space had become a blight for fly tipping, being overgrown and neglected. Some residents had been asking for years to use the space as a meanwhile community garden. We were going to develop this, but meanwhile it's a garden. I backed the project, made sure the legal documents were sorted out, and we handed it over. Now the space has been transformed with council help and residents driving the project. Good plants have been saved and everything else has been donated. A second larger site adjacent to a small allotment has followed and is now a meanwhile community garden, and there may soon be a third as a local growers hub. Allotments are longer term investments. They're required in Cambridge on larger developments within the current local plan. Developers have to provide 0.4 hectares per 1,000 people, and it's paid for via Section 106 agreements. Land is allowed for allotments in urban extensions or within the city, or if within a city, then the developers will have to pay to enhance existing allotments. New allotments are usually required to be delivered by condition after a certain number of homes are occupied. It is known that these are an important part of enabling the communities to come together. However, I found that they are almost all late. Since being elected, I've had to push hard to get 3 handed over, while 1 remains 7 years late due to complicated legal situation. Now I've asked for a review of the planning conditions to learn how we can have fewer, how they can be better written, and how they can be delivered on time. We have to ensure that where they can be provided in new developments, that they are and on time. Almost all new developments, we're getting community orchards as part of landscaping. We're also getting community orchards as part of landscaping proposals, as a fruit tree can provide 20 times more biodiversity than a standard non-fruit tree. We also need to think about how people get the food they need, especially as we cope with the decade of brutal government cutbacks, the COVID pandemic, and the imminent shock of Brexit. So we need to find places where people can share food or plant for their gardens, or where they can learn about nutrition and cooking and have opportunities to come together to celebrate with festivals and meals. These are spaces in community buildings and open spaces. We constantly have new community buildings and civic places being completed in new developments, and like allotments, the importance of these places are known about and must be challenged. When things locked down in March, I helped set up a food hub in a community centre in my ward, and it still runs once a week to provide food from local businesses for people who are struggling. We can work to make sure that planning conditions allow such uses and don't get in the way of helping people to cope. If we want this sort of provision to work, then we need to engage with the planning system. Practically, that means having councillors who care and who understand how to use the system to support the goals of organisations like Sustain. So I'd like to end up with some practical steps that can be taken based on my experience as an architect, food activist and a counsellor. Ask for a review of conditions. Get the wording of the conditions right. Ask that enforcement officers are consulted on the wording of conditions to make their job easier when asked to carry out enforcement. Check that council officers understand what is being provided and ensure that they have the time and authority to have these delivered when due. Where supplementary planning policies are produced, ask for food growing opportunities, community centres with appropriate kitchens, civic spaces with water and power supplies. Consider the extra wealth of biodiversity that food growing offers. Make it a biodiversity matter. Get involved with local nature partnerships and talk about food growing. Engage with the National Farmers Union, the NUF, on debates about soil quality and the value of farmland. Question why farmland is being put forward as development land. And as your local authorities work on their new local plans, in England at least, bring in food wherever possible. Ensure it comes under defined priorities of well-being, climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, and the fight against inequality. This isn't enough, but it is how I believe we can use the planning system to deliver on some of our goals. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. So it's interesting that even when there are planning conditions, then they're not necessarily being implemented. And I think I would hope that once you got that far and once it had been accepted into the planning application, so do you think partnerships should be have a volunteer that's scrutinising planning applications and following these up? You know, what's going to actually make that happen?
I think I found in Cambridge that a lot of people think that once an application is approved, that it will just be delivered, and but the developers their priority is not really delivering the community centres or delivering food growing opportunities. They are building the number of houses to sell them and make profit, and it's residents seem to be aware about the need to push and make sure the community centres are delivered, but the allotments just get forgotten, and they're so important. And we know this much more now than ever because of the crisis we've gone through and the shutdown. The support that allotments have given people during this shutdown has been tremendous. And it's really focused us on understanding the food growing opportunities. But it is such a battle, and we need to speak out much more about the ensuring the opportunities come that we can have are delivered properly. So don't wait until it's delayed. You need to speak out to ensure they're delivered on time. Before. Is
it helpful for you to have people in the community
yes
pressing you as a counsellor?
Absolutely. I really feel that I would suggest that it's even at election time, I would suggest that this should be something that's asked on the doorstep of people who are standing to represent their communities. If food growing opportunities are important, that should be asked of people who are coming forward to represent residents.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions. I think one of them is on the new government proposals, which we'll hold over to later. I think we need to understand what's actually operating now and will be operating for the next few years. Another one is, after local plans have been finalised and published, isn't it too late for amendments? So I think I would say, well, they will be reviewed, but also if we go to Emily now, she can tell us how the follow-up documents can come in and back up those local plan policies and help to fill in some of the gaps.
Thanks, Gillian. Good afternoon, everyone, and brilliant to hear from Cambridge and from Katie, who just does such astonishing and amazing work there. Can I just check whether people can see the presentation? Katie or Gillian, could you give me a wave?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. I'm never entirely trusting of the technology. So my name's Emily O'Brien. I'm the Policy and Partnerships Manager at Brighton Hove Food Partnership. We're one of the earliest forming food partnerships, if not the earliest, established in 2003. And the planning project we've been doing, which I'm sort of here to talk about today, works really well for us because it's about, it fits in with our ethos of working at different levels. So we work with individuals, we work with groups, and we also work at a strategy and policy level. And our planning and food project, or food and planning, you say either way around, very much fits into our food strategy approach. It's part of our current food strategy action plan. So that's divided across the 9 areas of the food system, and one of them is about policy, and our work with trying to influence the planning system locally fits under that. So I was just going to say a little bit about the history of the current project then. So we have been working as a food partnership for quite a while on planning policy. So we've recently refreshed our planning advice note, and that's the main thing that I'm going to talk about now. But actually that's a refresh of a document that was developed in 2011 initially. So it's a kind of update from an earlier bit of work. I think it's really important to say as well, planning advice note is technical guidance. So some people call them technical guidance notes or TGNs. You get them called different things in different areas. And it's technical guidance, which means it's not making policy. So as Gillian set out really well, it's important to also influence the policy upstream, because you can't hang off technical guidance note if you don't have the policy. It's clarifying stuff that's written in elsewhere. So our 2011 planning advice note, which the Food Partnership worked in consultation with the City Council on, or supported the City Council along with Food Matters, our sister organisation, that was adopted. And then really what needed to happen was it needed updating. So 2011 was quite a while ago, things have changed. It was also quite a kind of early bit of work on food and planning. So I think there's, more good practices come through. There's been a lot of changes in planning policy as well, the National Planning Policy Framework. Also, as a start to the refresh, we had some evaluation done. So that was a really nice partnership project with the University of Brighton. We had one of their master students in town planning who had a particular interest in food and planning, did as an evaluation, spoke to planners, developers, about how it had worked, and we could really see that some bits of it weren't working very well. So it was a chance to address those and see what was missing. I should say the other background to refresh is it's I think, as Gillian set out really well, it's quite a hard time to get things done in planning. There's a lot of resource constraints. Teams are really busy. There's a lot of stuff coming at people. It's really hard being a planner at the moment. So it really helped that we had a public pledge to do this given by a city councillor. She stood up at one of the Peas Please events, and it was part of our Veg Cities pledge. So we made it part of a bigger pledge. So there was that councillor commitment, which, you can hear from the way Katie's talking, is really, really important to have that kind of councillor backing. So having said that, it was actually although it was really great to have the councillor backing, actually the way that we set it out wasn't going to work from the planner's point of view. So initially what we wanted to do is we wanted to update the planning advice note, the PAN, and we wanted to have this all singing, all dancing document that would become a supplementary planning document, or an SPD. And for those of you who don't know what those are, all that means it's got a bit more meat to it. It becomes policy, so it holds a little bit more weight, as the planners like to call it, when they're weighing things up, you know, should we or shouldn't we? It's got more weight if it's an SPD. And we also wanted it to expand it to include other aspects of the food system, such as access to shops, food access, you know, those broader things that other areas have been working on, fast food proliferation. But actually, it turned out the planners we were talking to just kept getting these really worried looks on their faces around that. And actually, it turned out that one all singing, all dancing SPD is really convenient from our point of view as a food partnership, but didn't fit in at all with the way that the planners were looking at it, as Gillian set out. So instead, what we ended up doing is we changed the approach. We delivered the same stuff, I hope. I'm really pleased with what we've achieved and what the City Council's achieved. But we just did it a slightly different way. So we split it into different bits of work. And this was very much sort of led, you know, a partnership effort. So sort of meeting the needs of the planners and the City Council. So we had a food and planning project, as we called it. It sounds grander than it is really. All we had really was a small group working together on this. And we had some support that we brought in from Sustain. So we had lovely Gillian, who presented at the beginning, acting as a consultant on the project. And we had a project board, which basically meant us getting together. And we looked at different, and we kind of integrated, we turned this idea of having one all singing, all dancing SPD, we kind of ended up delivering that in 3 different ways. So the first thing was that we revised and improved the planning advice note on food growing. And I'm really pleased to say that was finally adopted at committee on Thursday last week. So I've included a link to the blog, but it's not actually to the guidance note because that's still on the committee paper. So we'll update that at some point from our blog. So that's the bit of guidance about encouraging developers to incorporate food growing spaces in development. And as I said, that was really quite a long process. Even just doing that planning advice note, which wasn't, you know, doing everything, took 2 years really, and the consultation process was really important with that as well. So we didn't, obviously I've talked about how we talked to planners, and not just the planning policy team, but also the development management planners, the DMs, which are the people who actually assess the applications, because you can have a lovely bit of policy, but if it's just sitting on a shelf in an office, it makes no difference at all. And obviously we needed something that would work for developers as well, so that meant talking to developers and planning agents. So the second, so I was going to show some, just some of the pictures from it. I suppose what I should say as well is that it's actually, the planning advice note we did is very urban, so it's not necessarily something you can just pick up and take to somewhere else. If you've got a rural area, you'll have very different issues around land use and, you know, food processing and things. We're a really constrained city without a lot of space. So it's kind of relevant to our city. It's really rooted in that. And the aim of it was really to kind of inspire as well as to inform. So it's got really techie sort of guidance in it. So, you know, what you can plant in shade if you've got dry soil that still produces food. It's got a big focus, as Katie said, there's a lot of people doing kind of orchards and edible landscaping. That seems to be much more palatable to some developers than actually having a little designated food growing space that they worry about the maintenance. It's got really detailed advice about maintenance and management going forward as well. But it's also got some pictures in. So the ones at the top are all, the 2 at the top are from Brighton and Hove. There's a meanwhile garden that was made out of pallets, and then there's one of our community gardens. But at the bottom, it's showing some examples from elsewhere. So the idea is to kind of make it really relevant and local, but also to get people thinking and inspire developers. We do want them to think it's a good idea as well, and that they're going to make more money out of their development, so it's really worth their while. Second bit was to have a health impact assessment. So that brought in some of these wider issues that we weren't able to bring in the planning advice note. So, so it's a checklist basically, the health impact assessment checklist. It's a new one. I haven't got a link to it yet because I don't think it's quite been published. But it includes a series of questions about things like including, someone I was really pleased with that we got included was whether there might be access to a communal kitchen space, because that's something I'd like developers to think about, especially if they're doing really developments with very small kitchens, as increasingly happens in a constrained city like ours. But also everything from, you know, about access to shops and proliferation of fast food, that kind of thing. So some of those were built into this checklist. And we think that would be really helpful because actually we already had a sustainability checklist, and that's been a really effective tool, because when developers sign up their application, they're actually asked specific questions about what they're doing around food growing. And that's worked really well. So that's like, how many square meters of food growing are you providing? How many nut trees? How many fruit trees? Really, tangible questions. So we're hopeful that the health impact assessment checklist will also be a good tool. And then the final thing we're doing is hopefully food growing and some of the wider food access issues are also going to be built into a new urban design framework supplementary planning document. So that is the slightly more weighty document, an SPD, but rather than having a separate one that's just about food, it's being built into an urban design framework one. And we're just waiting. I don't know how successful that's been yet, because I'm waiting to see a draft of it, but fingers crossed. And then I was just going to, if I've got time, just check my time. Oh yeah, I just wanted to say a few of the things that I felt we learned from this now quite long-standing project about how we work with our city council. So the first thing is, apologies to any planners in the room, including Gillian, but it's about learning to think like a planner. So I think the thing that we've all said about making sure, Gillian put it really well at the beginning about making sure that we're framing what we want to achieve in the language of the planners is really important. And also recognising how busy those people are, how many pressures they have on them at the minute. Also really important to get the political commitment. So we have had Katie standing up. She's done amazing work driving that in her city, and it really, really helped that we had councillor commitment in our city as well. So I think it's really, really useful getting your councillor on board. Although I have to say that not all councillors are as informed as Katie's, obviously an architect and has amazing expertise around that. So the way you actually do it might be a little bit different than what the councillor thinks. Councillors aren't necessarily experts on planning. So I think there's a little bit of both there, getting the commitment from the councillor, but making sure the practicalities work with the officers. I think I always give this bit of tip whenever we do a talk, which is about being a helpful partner. Recognising how busy our planning department is, our officers, we tried to be really helpful. We sort of did a lot of organising. We set all the meetings, we did the agendas, we did notes really quickly. We followed up immediately if we said we were going to do something. And we also brought in a bit of resource to the project. So not just sort of our time project managing, but also the actual drafting was done by Gillian as a consultant. So that, and that was funded through Esme Fairbairn funding. They fund this particular project, my role. I think another bit of learning was just around time as well. I think that's already been mentioned today, but don't hold your breath. These things can really take time. I think there was just some other lessons as well, just some really practical things. It's already been referred to, but actually make sure that the local plans include food policy. So they're like the big policy documents, the real upstream ones that anything else kind of flows out of. And if you don't have a lot of time to be doing this project, then I would definitely look out for any consultations around local plan refreshes. We don't know what this is going to look like. Obviously, we're talking about the new changes coming. So, local plans might not work in the same way going forward. But for now, they are really important. And just to stress, none of this stuff can happen if there's nothing to hang it off in your local plan. So I don't think you're going to get something amazing done as a piece of technical guidance if it doesn't relate to what's in your local plan. I think the other bit of learning for me, I was all about the planning policy, and then I actually really realised that actually it's less important, the planning policy. I was really gutted that we weren't going to get to do an SPD. I was like, it was a failure, but actually in a way it doesn't matter, because what actually matters is how it gets used in practice. So if the officers are really on board with a good bit of technical guidance, a planning advice note, then that's going to be more effective than having an SPD that in theory has more weight but nobody knows about and sits on a shelf and nobody bothers with. And those checklists have been quite useful for that as well. Checklists, they don't go through any of the kind of formal consultation and stuff, but actually that's been really, really helpful from our point of view. I think that was it. I was going to just take a bit of a break now for a couple of questions and see if I can work out how to stop sharing my screen. Always a challenge.
Right, please, can you post any questions you've particularly got for Emily at this stage? The question that comes to mind is, you've seen it through to this stage, but how are you going to actually make sure that decisions are now made according to the new planning advice note and the local plan policy itself.
I think really key to that was engaging with the planning officers as part of it. So for a start, we work with quite a few of the planning policy officers making this happen, sitting on the board. There's also a sustainability officer in Brighton Hove City Council who comments on planning applications, and she was part of the project board. So part of her role is to be the kind of custodian, feeding in comments from a planning policy point of view into new applications that come on. So I think, because she was very much part of helping this to happen, I'm quite confident that she will also make sure those issues get flagged up. We do also occasionally, for big developments and things, put in a response ourselves, and that's something people might want to think about doing, which is if there's a big application in particular or something that you feel is really important, there's no harm in putting in a consultation response saying, we have a food partnership or whatever it is in your city. We think, we're all committed as a city to doing X, Y, and Z. We think this application should be recognising that. I think the other the reason why I think it will stick is because we did do quite a bit of engagement with developers and planning agents, as I say, because they've got to be on board as well, so they're aware of it. It's up their radar, and in reality, if you're a developer, you want to get planning permission, and if there's some easy boxes you can tick by including some food growing spaces, you're going to tick those boxes. The challenge is then making sure they stay the whole length of the development, but at least at that stage, if it's in there, there's more of a chance. And then I think the other thing is the fact that we didn't just talk to the policy team, but we also went and had a chat with did a kind of consultation session with the development management planners. So those are the other ones I talked about. You've got the two sides, you've got the policy team, but then the development management team. And weirdly, they often don't seem to talk to each other, as I found isn't just our planning department, it seems to be universal. So actually it was really important that hopefully, we could go along and inspire them a little bit as well, and make them feel like champions for that bit of work. And some of them got really keen. I've got to say that, most people get this agenda, don't they, once you start explaining it?
Yes, I think that's it. They do understand, because everybody is interested in food, and then when they think about it and then think about their role in it. But having seen busy planning offices and those planners that are dealing with planning applications, it's relentless each day. More and more planning applications come in. They pile up on their metaphorical desk. I'm sure it just comes in on their screen now. And they've got timescales to process those planning applications and get decisions out. And they're going to take not the easy option, but they've just got to get through that workload. And there will be other people lobbying them on other issues. So I think at the moment they do understand and they do get it, and maybe one, and it'd be great if there is one in the office, then follows that through. The others will forget it because the next day someone else came and had another meeting with them about another issue, about cycleways and transport links, and then the next day somebody came in on biodiversity.
It does get written in though, Julie. So when we've had a really major development, it actually includes in the heading, so every time it comes up is, which is the development of X, Y and Z houses and whatever community space in a school, and 1.89 hectares of food growing space. So once you've got it in the title, it's got more chance of happening, I think, because everybody sees the title, even if the rest gets forgotten.
Yes, and I think again there's possibly a role for partnerships to follow that up and to make sure that is implemented.
Do you want me to answer the procurement question in the chat really quickly?
Yeah.
It's just to say, we've done loads of work on procurement. Obviously, it's not completely within the planning thing we're doing today, but do have a look on our website. There's a case study about working on minimum buying standards. And we also organise something called the Good Food Procurement Group, which brings caterers and large, all the people who have large contracts together to collectively address some of the food issues. And that's been really successful. So do have a look on our website for that.
Maddie Longhurst was asking us about the economic case, and particularly about land values. And after all, planning is about how people use land, and that affects the landowners and what the best value that they can get from their land. So that is one of the reasons why planning is very political and very complicated and gets very legalistic, because certainly landowners are going to protect their land to get the best value from it. So it's another reason for understanding about the food system and the economics behind it. Yeah, so that's one of those things. Shall I go on now and do a bit of the update on the new system? Because there have been a few questions about that, and hopefully that will fill in some gaps there. So one of the reasons for holding this webinar right now was because the government has published a planning white paper, which is a consultation paper, and it's fundamental reform, they call it, of planning. There's a lot in it, but not a lot of detail. So at the moment, planners and lawyers and everybody else are poring over it, trying to read between the lines and try to work out how this is going to work out in reality, which is one of the reasons why I was saying concentrate on the system we've got now, but hopefully there will be some improvements and maybe there's some caution about the future. But there's certainly some hopeful items. So I've gone back to using this diagram, and this time in the top left-hand corner, I've doubled the development, because the whole impetus behind the reform of the planning system is to improve delivery of building houses. And it really does unapologetically concentrate on that, which is why there are lots of gaps in the white paper. So in order to get more development, the link through the planning application process, I've put it as dotted, because that is not going to be such a strong link anymore in terms of the application going to the district, to the local planning authority, and the local planning authority looking at its decision-making process and working through whether to give that planning application approval or not. The emphasis is very much going to be on the right-hand side, and not from the local plan, but going up to the national planning policy framework. And that is going to become much stronger in terms of directing the decision-making of the local planning authority as to whether that new development will go ahead or not. And in some cases, when the national planning policy framework, what it says, what it might say, we don't know yet, in conjunction with what the new sort of local plan will say, a lot of that will give a principle of development. So when the planning application is made, it'll be a different sort of planning application. And if you remember, I acknowledged that lots of people first get involved in planning as citizens because they're objecting to planning applications, they're objecting to the use of greenfield sites for development. That principle of development will be set in the local plan. So that cannot take place when the application or the type of application that needs to be made comes forward. As citizens, as the local planning authority, they can no longer debate the principle of that development. It's going to be the adherence to the details that is whether it gets permission to go ahead or not. And one of the ideas is to simplify local plans by taking a lot of the policies that are repeated throughout local plans out from local plans into the national planning policy framework. And I think this could work well for that, for the food system. There's all sorts of debates about how the public, how the community can engage in this, and who is going to make these decisions and where power sits. But I'll just explain a bit about how I understand the proposals at the moment. And the idea is that the local plan will be much more of a map-based plan. And the proposal is that areas are divided into 3 categories of land. One is growth, so that is likely to be greenfield sites, it could be large brownfield sites. And if you own land or wanted to develop in a growth area, the whole point that once that your land has been designated into the growth, that gives you your principle for development. So if you're an organisation that doesn't think that land should be used for building, that actually it's grade 1 agricultural land and should be used for growing food, then you have to get involved at the local plan stage. It will be too late because the principle of development will have been given. There's an intermediate sort of land where there's regeneration, and we're not sure how that'll work, because in most places there's such a mixture of land and land uses and ages of development. I think that's too broad brush an approach. But for those, and indeed for the growth areas, the detail will come in the detailed design codes. And that could well be something like a supplementary planning document is now, or sometimes master plans are done for sites. So again, the key is to get involved at that early stage. And some of those are being produced now, and I would advise you to get involved in them now, because if this whole new system comes about, some of those will be merged. They're bound to be merged or reframed to fill the gaps for them to meet the new system. So if you've already got the principle of sustainable food in your planning system now, should any of this come about, hopefully it will be a smooth transition and food will still be significant in the decision making in the future. The third category of land is protected land, and the expectation is that that will be wider countryside, national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty, conservation areas, even those are built developments already, and greenbelt. But we'll have to see whether greenbelt boundaries themselves are moved in order to allow more land for development. So it's all a big new world at the moment, and nobody quite knows how this will happen. We had a question earlier about infrastructure and couldn't well, at the moment allotments are being provided through what's called a Section 106 agreement. So it's an agreement that developers will provide the allotments. And where's the money for that sort of thing going to come from? And they're saying that infrastructure will just be provided for in one way, so not through conditions, not through the current infrastructure levy, but there will be a new infrastructure tax, as it were, and that will be paid for on occupation of the new houses, not at the beginning of development, which happens now, and which is difficult for developers to fund. So a lot of things won't happen until the end unless councils borrow in advance on the expectation of getting that levy, that tax later on. So that's a whole other area, again, that lawyers and developers and everybody's trawling over, and there's no detail. But just to say, I think you should keep going with planning now, because that will help with the transition. And in terms of good design, the assumption is that if a housing development is well designed and beautiful, and the word beautiful is used a lot, then it will get planning consent. So I've got an example here of the Hull Residential Design Guide, which has only just been published, and how that does show how space can be provided for food growing, even on tight sites. And the Nottingham Guide, which looks at well-being and design. So there are lots of these guides around at the moment. So I think it is still a good opportunity to get those done in your local areas, so that has already been agreed through the process, should it be required in future, and it certainly is required right now anyway. So it's not effort that's wasted. There's not a lot on health, surprisingly. given that planning and health grew up together. But that's an example here for Blackburn and Darwin, that in their health supplementary planning documents, they looked at healthy developments as a whole, but they included space for food growing, and they included hot food takeaway policies. Now, I think the major opportunity for us as food partnerships is to think about the policies that we think are universal policies that really do apply across everywhere. Certainly in all urban areas, there are certain types of policies. There's certain types of policies for peri-urban areas, on the urban edge, in the green belt, and certain types of policies that maybe are only applicable in rural areas. And I don't think it would take us very long to decide what those key policies are. And why are we all wasting time asking for these policies in our local plans when they could be included at the national level in the national planning policy framework? And the only reason that will happen is if we as a campaigning organisation and as networks actually ask for that to happen, because otherwise I think there's so much concentration on the other issues, and other people are shouting. It needs us to come forward and put that case forward. So my ask, I think, is to say, do you know of areas of policy that have worked well in your patch that you would recommend going to the national level? Have you got examples that you could send us, that we could send on to government and say, well, this is a policy that works well? And is this an approach that you think we should be following, really? So that's where I was going to stop in terms of the future planning system. We've got time, well, we've only got a few seconds really if we wanted to have a wider policy discussion. But if I could just sort of say, and you get the slides, we've got recommendations for the next steps. And if you could look at those, think about them, and if you'd like more support, if you'd like some more meetings like this, but perhaps more on a masterclass basis, then that's something we could certainly think about. So I'll stop there as we have got to our hour's time. And are there any particular questions, or is there anything that the rest of the panel of Katie and Emily want to say at this stage? And you'll have to both unmute yourself. Katie.
Can I just say thank you? Sorry, Gillian, I haven't got anything to add, just to say thank you. It's been a really useful session and great to hear from everyone. And do get in touch if you've got questions.
Yes, I think it's been really useful. I love hearing from Emily and Gillian, but I think we ought to, where there are good examples of food growing within individual buildings or developments, we really ought to give them as much credit as possible. We need to tell people that it's actually not that difficult and really hold these great examples up, maybe give them separate awards as well. Thanks.
We've got a question about the housing numbers, and if you've got areas of what will be these protected areas in your local planning authority area, does that mean your housing target will have to be crammed into small areas? And the expectation is at the moment that that is one of the policies that's going to be led by national government. National government is going to give each local planning authority its new housing targets, and we don't know what level of debate there'll be towards that, but the algorithms they use will take into account the potential they have to deliver those numbers. So if you have protected land in your local planning authority area, you will have lower housing numbers. I think maybe some of the other questions, keep keep posting them until Sophia closes us down, and also send them to me, because then we can, there's my link there, we can answer them outside of this meeting or in a future meeting. And send me a personal email if there's something that applies to you in your area that perhaps you weren't too sure about, but you'd like to ask me to, and I'll answer you on a personal basis. So I think that's it for us.
Thanks, Gillian. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much for joining, everyone. I'll leave the chat open for a few more minutes.